And as Greg alluded in that prayer, we are going to start a new series today in Principles Hour.
But just wait a minute. You hooked us in last time with this lovely series called The Journey to Jerusalem. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we never made it to Jerusalem.
I was hoping no one would notice.
Well, I'm sure there's some out there who haven't noticed, and I actually hadn't noticed until we planned this interview. However, now that I have noticed, I'm deeply disappointed.
Don't be. Part 2 is still to come of the journey to Jerusalem. We haven't made it there yet. You can read ahead if you want to find out how the journey ends. But we'll probably come to that in a few semesters' time. But this semester, we're going to start a new series from the Old Testament, from the book of Daniel. And the series is going to be called Anchored Exiles, Living in Hope in a Hostile World.
That sounds fabulous. And I think Daniel will also provide a lot of travel and a lot of excitement, lions, all the things that none of us can experience here in lockdown. So, and on top of that, some rich spiritual blessings. So thank you. That's great. I'm excited. And I'm going to read for us now from Daniel 1. I'm going to read the whole chapter. Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus.
Thank you, Anna. Well, I'm going to begin today with 3 snapshots, 3 moments from my life. The first one comes from 20 years ago. See, I'm just beginning my career as a lawyer at this time, and I'm still very much at that stage of finding my feet, getting established. And a superior tells me to stretch the truth a little on an internal document, to lie. If I do this, I'll benefit financially, career-wise. If I don't do it, I could get this superior, who's very senior and influential in the law firm, offside. What do I do? Okay, the second one comes from 10 years ago. We're living in Southeast Asia. I'm driving our car. A traffic policeman pulls me over. My heart sinks because traffic policemen are notorious for asking for bribes. He comes to my window and he says, "You violated a traffic law. The process of dealing with this could be very complicated, time-consuming, expensive. We might even have to hold on to your car until it's sorted out. Unless, of course, you want to sort this out right now, just between you and me. What do I do? The third one comes from 5 years ago. We're still living in Southeast Asia at this time, and I'm at an official government function, and I'm having a conversation with a man, but within earshot are some high-ranking government officials. The conversation I'm having with the man turns to spiritual matters, and when I explain that I'm a follower of Jesus, he asks me the question, what is a follower of Jesus? So here's this perfect opportunity to share the good news. But proselytism is actually illegal, and if I get overheard and reported, our whole family could lose our visas and get sent back to Australia. What do I do? There we have 3 moments, 3 snapshots from my life. And each one of them, I knew what God's way required. But at each time, I felt pressure, strong pressure to compromise. Why? Well, it's because the people who didn't follow God were in charge, were in control. People who didn't follow or know God's ways weren't seeking to advance his purposes. They were the ones that were, in some sense, in authority over me at the time. So it felt like if I lived God's way, if I lived an undefiled life for God, it felt like it wouldn't be good for me. It wouldn't even necessarily be safe for me. I wonder, have you had moments like that? At work, as a student, as a parent, with your finances, in your ministry, moments where you felt pressure to compromise your commitment to God's way. Have you had moments like that? I'm sure that you have. Will you have more moments like that in the future? I'm sure that you will. You see, as followers of Jesus, as people committed to his ways, to his purposes, we want to have the courage, don't we? We want to have the courage to live undefiled lives, holy lives, obedient lives. We want to have the courage to choose God's way, even when forces hostile to God seem to be in charge, seem to be in control, seem to be in authority over us. So how? How do we do that? How do we find the courage to live an undefiled life in a hostile world? That's our question this morning. How do we find the courage to live an undefiled life in a hostile world? Well, today we're going to look to Daniel chapter 1, which Anna read out a few moments ago, for an answer. So if you don't already have your Bible open to Daniel chapter 1, please do that now. Daniel chapter 1, as soon as we start reading it, straight away, we discover that Daniel's world, like ours, is a hostile one. Just have a look at these opening verses with me. I'll read from verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. So the year is 605 BC, and this is the beginning of defeat and exile for the people of the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. It's an exile that's going to unfold in 3 waves, and this is the first wave here where a small group of nobility are taken to Babylon. The second wave is going to come in 8 years' time, where a larger group will be taken, and then 11 years after that, in 587 BC, the third and final wave will come. That's when the Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is burned to the ground, and all the remaining Jews, except the very poorest, are taken to Babylon. So this is the setting of our story. This is Daniel's world. The kingdom of God is falling apart. The promised land has been lost. A hostile power is in control of God's people. And did you notice what King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon did? Did you notice what he did in verse 2? He took articles from the temple of God and he put them in the temple of his God. That's a pretty clear message there, isn't it? In fact, this was a very normal way to send a message in the ancient world. It's kind of like a victory dance today. It's a public shaming of the Israelites and their faith. Nebuchadnezzar is saying, my God has defeated yours. My God is more powerful than yours. Me and my God, we're in control. Do you ever see a public shaming of Christianity like that today in our world? Maybe when you read news articles from secularists celebrating the demise of the church. Maybe when you hear cultural leaders ridiculing Christians as outdated, as fools, as backing a weak God who's already been disproved. Well, that was Daniel's world, and in many ways it's our world too. Nebuchadnezzar is doing this victory dance. And there's something else that I want us to notice here in this setting in the first few verses. It says there in verse 2 that the setting is Babylon, right? The king takes the articles to his temple in Babylonia, it says. But if you've got an NIV at least, and you look at the footnote, you'll see that what it actually has in the original is not Babylonia, it's Shinar. I wonder if that place name, Shinar, rings any bells for you. Way back in Genesis 11, the place where the people settle in defiance of God's command, the place where they build the Tower of Babel, that place was called Shinar. It's an old place name for Babylon. So why does the author use that old place name here? I think he wants to tell us that the setting for this story is a place of evil, a place of rebellion against God. It's a place where enemies of God, enemies of God's people, are in charge, are in control. So this is the setting. This is Daniel's world. Powers hostile to God are in charge. And it's not too different from our world, is it? In our world, powers hostile to God are often in charge too. Maybe it's going to be a boss or a government official. Maybe it's the laws of the land. Maybe it's cultural forces, the media. Maybe it's what people say at the water cooler in the office. You see, like Daniel, we are living outside the promised land. Like Daniel, we're living in a world where people in authority over us are often hostile to God and hostile to God's purposes. So that's the setting that we have in Daniel 1. Now, how does Daniel fit into all of this? Well, Daniel is one of the exiles in this first wave of exiles. Have a look from verse 3. Verse 3 says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. What's Nebuchadnezzar up to here? Why does he take the best and brightest from Israel, young men, upper class, high IQ? Why does he take them? Well, let's keep reading and see what his strategy is. Continuing in verse 4, he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So do you see what Nebuchadnezzar's up to here? He's taking this elite group of Israelites, cream of the crop, and he's going to reprogram them, re-educate them, brainwash them. He's going to turn them from Israelite teenagers into Babylonian officials, Babylonian wise men. Why? So that he can use them as tools of the state, tools of control and power. You see, like anyone building an empire, Nebuchadnezzar wants control of the region. And his strategy here is to take the elite Israelites and to win them over to the ways of Babylon. Verse 4, he's going to teach them the language and the literature of Babylon. Verse 5, he feeds them the food and wine from his own table. And this is to go on for 3 years. It's a bit like a BTH, isn't it? Or an MDiv. 3 years. And then at the end of those years, he'll have won them over to the ways of Babylon. They will be enamored with it. He'll have won their hearts and minds. And then he'll use them. These Israelites who have been converted to Babylonianism, he'll use them to control their own people. Maybe from Babylon as officials, or maybe sending them back to Israel to positions of influence there. So that is his strategy. So you see, for Nebuchadnezzar, what's at stake in all of this is political control. But for Daniel and his friends, what's at stake for them is their very allegiance to God. Will they have the courage to resist? Will they have the courage to live undefiled lives in a hostile world? Perhaps the clearest signalling of Nebuchadnezzar's intent comes in the next couple of verses. Have a look with me at verses 6 and 7. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, this name changing is really significant. Daniel's name means God is my judge. God, El, the God of Israel, is my judge. But that name is wiped from the record, and it's replaced with Belteshazzar, which means may Bel, and Bel is a reference to Marduk, the Babylonian chief god, may Bel protect his life. It's quite a shift, isn't it? From God, the God of Israel, to Bel, the God of Babylon. This is Nebuchadnezzar's plan here. And it's the same for Daniel's three friends. Hananiah, which means Yahweh has been gracious, is to become Shadrach, which means the command of Aku, the moon god. Mishael, which means who is what God is to become Meshach, which means who is what Aku, the moon god, is. And Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped, is to become Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, which was another Babylonian god. So do you see Nebuchadnezzar's plan here? Daniel and his friends will no longer serve Yahweh, no longer depend on Yahweh, no longer entrust themselves to Yahweh for help, for grace, for provision. See, now they'll serve the Babylonian gods. Whatever they have, whatever prosperity comes their way, they will owe it to Babylon. So for Daniel and his friends, this is not just a new name. If Nebuchadnezzar has his way, it's a whole new allegiance. What about for us? What new name does the world want to give us? What new identity does the world want to foist on us? You see, what Babylon wants for Daniel and his friends is actually far more frightening than just to defeat him, just to defeat them. Babylon wants to subsume them. It wants to win their souls, to give them a new identity, a new allegiance. It wants to entice them to abandon the God of Israel. And I've got to say, there are people, there are cultural forces in the world around us that want the same thing too. They want to subsume us. They want to win us over. They want to entice us to abandon Jesus. So, what will Daniel do? Being given these new names, will he have the courage to live an undefiled life in this hostile world? The answer is yes, he will. That's what we see in verse 8, isn't it? Verse 8, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. There's a wordplay in verses 7 and 8. It doesn't come out in the English translation, but what makes it clear is that what we have in verse 8, this wordplay makes it clear that what we have in verse 8 is actually a response, a direct response to the name giving in verse 7. Let's just have a look at this wordplay with me. So the wordplay is on the word put, the English word put. So verse 7, it says the chief official put new names on Daniel and his friends. And then by way of response in verse 8, it says Daniel put it on his heart not to eat the royal food. So this resolution that Daniel makes about food, it's his bold response to Babylon. Babylon puts these new names on him, he puts on his heart to resolve not to defile himself. Now you might be wondering, why would the royal food and wine defile Daniel anyway? Well, some think it's because maybe the food wasn't kosher. Eating it would break the Old Testament food laws. But that's not a great explanation because it wouldn't explain the wine, at least. There were no Old Testament food laws against drinking wine, except for Nazarites. Others think that the royal food and wine might have been offered to the Babylonian gods, and so to eat it would be to participate in idol worship. But Daniel ate the vegetables, and they might well have been offered to idols as well. And to make matters more complicated, later in the book, many years later, later in the book of Daniel, Daniel actually does eat some of the rich royal food and wine from the king's table, and apparently he does so without defiling himself. So what's going on here? I think that eating the royal food and wine would define Daniel in this situation because eating it would be giving in to what Nebuchadnezzar is doing here. See, I think this is Daniel's way of saying no to Nebuchadnezzar's conversion plan. See, Nebuchadnezzar is feeding him both mind and body. Nebuchadnezzar wants to seduce him, wants to subsume him, to win him over to the ways of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar wants to make Daniel something special. And when, after 3 years, Daniel has become something special, Nebuchadnezzar wants Daniel to say, I owe all this to Babylon and its gods. It's in the name, his new name, right? May Bel protect his life. Belteshazzar. And so Daniel here says no to all of that. He will not be defiled. He will not be defiled by entrusting his well-being to Babylon, to Bel, to Marduk. If Daniel's going to prosper, and he will, if Daniel's going to prosper, it will be because of Yahweh, not because he's dined on the rich food and wine from Nebuchadnezzar's table. So Daniel says no to the food and the wine. Now let's be really clear. This is a very risky move from Daniel. Whenever you or I say no to someone in authority over us, whenever we make a stand to someone in power, there's going to be risk involved. To see just how risky it was for Daniel, have a look at the official's response in verse 10. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. This official knows what Nebuchadnezzar is like. He knows that Nebuchadnezzar is the kind of guy who impulsively will kill whole groups of people, as he is going to go on to do in chapters 2 and 3. So this official knows that you don't say no to Nebuchadnezzar. If the official might lose his head over Daniel's food strike, imagine what might happen to Daniel. This is a risky move from Daniel. Decisions to make a stand for God, to live undefiled lives for God, involve risk, serious risk. This is a high risk for Daniel here, and there will be high risk for us too. See, if we live undefiled lives for God in our hostile world, if we follow God's ways in our financial dealings, at work, in our parenting, in our ministry, there will be risk for us too. We mustn't underestimate the risks of living undefiled lives for God. So, Daniel's taken this courageous, risky option, but he's hit a snag, hasn't he? The chief official doesn't want to risk his own head. So what's Daniel going to do next? Is he going to abandon the plan because now it's got the potential to hurt innocent bystanders like this official? No, he's not. He keeps trying. He comes up with another idea. He tries someone else. This time he goes directly to the guard, his guard. And in verses 11 to 13, he proposes a test to this guard. He says, "Give us 10 days of water and vegetables, and then see how we compare to everyone else." And in verse 14, the guard agrees, and so the test is on. How does it go? How does this 10-day test go? Well, when you think of a vegetable diet, you might have in your head this idea of the modern vegan who eats this scientifically planned and balanced diet, balanced with reference to the healthy eating pyramid. That's not what we're talking about here. That's not what Daniel has here. If we're going to read this passage as the author intended us to understand it, we need to realise that Daniel is having the diet of the malnourished poor man of the time. And so we as readers, when we hear about this test, one group eating rich royal food and wine and the other vegetables and water, what we expect is that the rich food and wine group are going to be healthier and stronger. That's what we expect. But it's not what happens, is it? The opposite happens. Verse 15, it says, "At the end of the 10 days, they," that is Daniel and his friends, "looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food." Daniel and his friends, having just broccoli and water, are doing better than the men who are eating the full royal banquet. How? How could this be possible? That question takes us to the very heart of the message of Daniel chapter 1. How could the broccoli eaters be stronger than the banqueters? The answer is because God is at work. God has worked a miracle here. God has intervened here. God is at work. And so here's the message of this narrative, Daniel chapter 1. The message is that despite appearances, despite the appearance that Nebuchadnezzar's in control, or the Babylonian gods are in control, despite those appearances, God is the one who is in control. He's at work. He's carrying out his purposes. That's the message of Daniel 1. In fact, if we look back over the narrative so far, we'll see that the narrator's actually been building this point right from the start of the narrative. There's something I want us to notice in this narrative. There's a key phrase that pops up 3 times through this chapter. It's God gave. God gave. This phrase doesn't always come out clearly in English translations. Some translations use different verbs, the NIV does. But in the Hebrew, it's the same verb each time. Gave. God gave. So I'm going to show you those 3 just now so we can see how God is building this case. The narrator is building this case. First one, this is right back at the start. When Nebuchadnezzar defeated the king of Judah, the appearance was that Nebuchadnezzar was in control, right? But actually, verse 2, the narrator tells us, God gave the king of Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Despite appearances, God's in control. The second one, when Daniel asked permission not to eat the royal food and wine, the appearance was that the chief official was the one who was in control and that Daniel was at his mercy. But actually, verse 9, God gave the official favour and compassion towards Daniel. Despite appearances, God is in control. The third one comes at the end of the passage. After the 10-day test, Daniel continues with his 3 years of education. Daniel and his friends eating vegetables, everyone else eating the rich royal food. And at the end of those 3 years, in verse 19, there's a final exam. King Nebuchadnezzar is the examiner, and he finds Daniel and his friends to be top of the class. So again, what we have is an appearance here. The appearance this time is that the Babylonian education system and the Babylonian gods have achieved great things in these 4 men. But actually, verse 17, why did they really come top of the class? Verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. God gave the king of Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. God gave the chief official favour to Daniel, and God gave Daniel and his friends knowledge and understanding. Despite appearances, God is in control. He's in control, he's at work, he's carrying out his purposes. Daniel and his friends are prospering, but not because of Bel, not because of Marduk, not because of Babylon. They're prospering because of Yahweh, because of the true God. Just notice what the narrator does in verse 19. Verse 19 says, "The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." Notice, he doesn't use their Babylonian names there. He doesn't call them Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He calls them, "God is my judge. Yahweh has been gracious. Who is what God is? And Yahweh has helped." They don't owe their success to Bel or Marduk or Aku or Nebo. They owe their success to Yahweh. Despite appearances, God is in control. And that's where chapter 1 ends. Despite the appearance that these hostile powers are in control, these 4 men who've been faithful to God are actually prospering. They're in the king's service, they're safe, they're protected by God. And in fact, according to verse 21, which jumps forward some decades, these guys Daniel is going to outlive the Babylonian Empire itself. Daniel's going to remain in the king's service until King Cyrus of Persia takes over. Despite appearances, God is in control. Let's go back to the question that we started with. How do we find the courage to live an undefiled life in a hostile world? Daniel and his friends have just done that in this story, haven't they? They're living in a hostile world, one that wants to subsume them, one that wants to seduce them, and yet they've found the courage to live undefiled lives. How? How did they find the courage to do that? They knew the very thing that the narrator wants us to learn through this story. That despite appearances, God is in control. Despite appearances, foreign land, exile, evil king, God is still in control. God is still working out his purposes. See, Daniel and his friends knew that. They trusted that. And that's why they were able to live an undefiled life. And when you and I know that, when we trust that, we too, by the Spirit's enabling, we will be able to find the courage to live undefiled lives in our hostile world. See, like Daniel, we do live in a hostile world. Here in Australia, it's a world where our faith is ridiculed in our culture, in the media. In some parts of the world, the hostility is far more extreme than that still. And so like Daniel, if we're going to choose to live undefiled lives for God, it will require great courage and it will involve great risk. But the message of Daniel 1 is that with God's help, we can do it. When, like Daniel, we know and trust in the fact that God is in control. See, that's the secret. That's what Daniel knew and trusted in. That's what courageous saints throughout the Bible and throughout history knew and trusted in. That's what Jesus is the ultimate example of one who found the courage to live an undefiled life for God. He's the only one who's ever done that perfectly, and he did that for us. That's what Jesus knew and trusted in, and that's what you and I must trust in. This truth that despite appearances, God is in control. And so knowing and trusting that, we can live undefiled lives for him with his empowering. And when we do that, he works out his purposes through us. I know this is what's important to us here at SMBC, isn't it? God carrying out his mission. See, when we live undefiled lives for God, he works out his purposes through us. Just think about what lies ahead for Daniel and his 3 friends. By the end of chapter 1, in terms of impact on the world, not much has happened yet, right? But in the coming chapters, These men, these 4 men will do mighty acts for God. They will have an impact for God. They will interpret dreams. They will speak God's message to kings. They will witness to God's glory by refusing to bow down to idols. They're going to go on to have a very public, a very impactful, a very significant ministry. And so with that in mind, just think back to the importance of this chapter. This is the start of their time in Babylon. They resist defilement. They remain holy for God's use, and God chooses to use them. In fact, in verse 17, we saw a moment ago, he gives them the gifts that they will need to serve him in Babylon. Daniel particularly gets the gifts of understanding dreams and visions. Just notice what's happened here in chapter 1. Daniel has entrusted himself to God. He's remained pure for God, undefiled, and God has chosen to gift him to carry out his purposes. This first allegiance test for Daniel is a relatively private one. Not many people know he isn't eating the royal food, just 3 friends and the guard, but God as well. God knows, God sees. And when God sees that, he chooses to entrust Daniel with gifts to carry out his purposes. Do you remember the 3 stories that I started with at the beginning? The pressure to lie at the law firm, the pressure to bribe a policeman, the pressure to stay silent about the gospel. I didn't think about it this way at the time, but as I look back on that first one, when I was a fresh-faced lawyer straight out of uni facing my first ethical dilemma in the workplace, I can't help but wonder now as I look back on that if God put that in my path as part of my preparation for future ministry challenges. See, at the time that the challenge seemed relatively private, almost no one would know if I went ahead and did that lie, but looking back, I now see that I had bigger and more public challenges to come, and no doubt still do. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if that moment at the law firm was part of my preparation for service. What about you? Is now a time of preparation for you? We've been looking at Daniel's time of preparation, 3 years in the king's court. Many of you have 3 years at SMBC at the moment. And for Daniel, his greatest trials, we know, because when we read on to the rest of the book of Daniel, his greatest trials still lay ahead of him. And for many of you, for many of us, I suspect that that's the same. Our greatest trials still lie ahead in contexts of your future ministries, our future ministries. So if now is a time of preparation, then now is the time to develop the habit of living undefiled lives for God. Even in private things like finances, your thought life, your sexuality. Now is the time to develop that habit of living undefiled lives for God, of being enriched by God and God alone, not by Bel or Marduk, not by the gods of this age, but by God and God alone. Let's close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we rejoice that you are in control every bit as much as you were in control when Daniel entered Nebuchadnezzar's court. Please give us undivided hearts and minds. Please give us the courage to live undefiled lives for you. We long for you to be pleased to use us to carry out your purposes. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. That's all for today. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.